Ladies and gentlemen, you seem to be laughing. Um, I don't know if some of you here are pro-Brexit. I, for one, always thought that indeed AIDA was Boris Johnson in disguise. But for those of you pro-Brexiters, I have good news. Europe is dying, or rather, three different Europes are dying. Now, before I continue, I would like to say that I am a firm supporter and believer in the European project. And yet, I can't but feel a little distraught when I see where our beloved union is heading this last years. Today, I want to talk to you, as I said, about the three deaths of Europe, its three mistakes, and to end on a positive note, a personal wish. Now, I said that Europe is dying three different deaths, and it is so. The Europe after 1945 is dying, as is that of after 1968 and that of after 1989. It's somewhat funny because these are three very different periods in time, and yet they are all collapsing at the same time. Let's start by the Europe of 1945. That is, after all, where it all started, how it all started, because that's the Europe of those who lived and remember the horrors of war and destruction, and who lived in constant fear for their life and for losing all they had. That was the generation that was determined to make that war the last war, and to never have to face such horrors again. We tend to say that we have to learn from our history, but as Angela Merkel said, we will see how much we actually learned from history when the last of that generation has disappeared and they're no longer with us to remember. I also said that the Europe of 1968 is dying. That was the Europe of revolutions. That was the Europe of inclusion. The Europe where millions went and took to the streets to see for the first time the state from the perspective of those who have not life so easy as we do. And last but not least, the Europe of 1989. It was the Europe of the Iron Curtain, of the wall of shame, a wall that was torn down peacefully, thanks to the will of people striving to come closer to the West, but not only, to also be part of the West. Now, these last two Europes, that of 1968 and 1989, I have to say that they are as good as dead. That has been proven by the economic crisis of 2008 and by the migrant crisis, or rather its management, of 2015. Now we see that the Europe of the Visegrad Group sees no further need of further inclusion with their Western allies and has grown bold. And we see how wealthy countries and regions are blaming those who are not as well off for all their suffering. They are fearing for their own well-being and are trying to vote and co-opt as a majority so as not to become the next minority. Here we also see two of the first mistakes of the European Union. The first is the lack of political ambition. This has been shown in the last two crises that I mentioned. After all, anyone can rule when things go right, but it's when things go wrong that you must show that you can lead. And that's what the European Union wasn't able to do. That's because the European Union is being held hostage by its own member states. That's the second big mistake of the EU. After the constitutional treaty failed and that weird, twisted construct that is the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, we served the Council, that is the body that represents the European Union member states, we served the European Union in a golden platter. And I can tell you that the member states are still feasting on what we served them, and that they are not going to stop because they are trying to cover their insatiable greed and their political mediocrity with the achievements that took years to conquer. But maybe the EU's biggest mistake is communication. That has been its main problem, always has. They have not been able to convey their message. And maybe that's because they are still on the mindset of the Europe of the period after 1945. Because yes, you must understand what happened and confront your past. And yes, you have to learn and know where you're coming from to know where you want to go. But you cannot constantly stir the fear of war and try to get any reaction from a generation that is used to having at least 3 warm meals a day. You cannot expect to talk about the woes of war and to talk about terrible hardships and get us to look up from our smartphones, because that is not what we are going to do. We don't want to talk about the past, we want to talk about the future. We want to talk about our jobs, about social welfare, about inclusion, about equality. We don't want to talk about what was, we want to understand what was, to harness that understanding and together shape what is yet to be. I promised I would finish on a positive note, and that positive note is actually a wish. I wish that our politicians recover their common sense. And for them to recover their common sense, I firmly believe that we all need to calm down, take a breath, take a step back, and with a cool head, think not what will the EU of tomorrow be, but what can I do so that those 3 deaths that Europe is dying are not in vain. Thank you very much.